On March 31st, 2026, the Canadian Prime Minister stepped up to a microphone and used two words to describe an Israeli military operation. Two words that, frankly, no Canadian leader had ever uttered in the entire history of the country.
Right.
He called it an illegal invasion.
Yeah.
So welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are tracking just a monumental rupture in global diplomacy.
It really is.
We are specifically examining this massive, 20-year evolution in Canadian foreign policy regarding the Middle East. And our roadmap for this today, for you listening, is a highly detailed analysis that was actually just published today.
Hot off the presses.
Literally today, April 17, 2026, in the Global Review. It's this incredible piece by Dr. Fareed Novin, and it's titled Navigating the Complexities of Global Socioeconomic Issues.
Catchy title.
Right. Very academic. But it meticulously contrasts Canada's response to conflicts between Israel and Lebanon back in 2006 with the exact situation we are seeing right now in 2026.
What's fascinating here is that to understand why those two words, illegal invasion, are so incredibly explosive, you really have to look at the underlying architecture of diplomacy.
Right. They don't just say these things by accident.
Exactly. Words like that, they do not happen in a vacuum. They represent a fundamental dismantling of a foreign policy doctrine that had been locked in place for 2 decades.
Yeah.
So to grasp the sheer scale of Prime Minister Mark Carney's statement, we essentially have to travel back to a previous prime minister who looked at an almost identical geopolitical landscape and reached the exact opposite conclusion.
The exact opposite.
Mm-hmm.
But before we trace how we got from point A to point B, it is absolutely vital that we lay out our mission clearly to you, the listener.
Yes, very important.
Because we are analyzing highly charged, ongoing, real-world conflicts here.
Real people, real lives.
Exactly. So our role today is to serve strictly as your impartial guides to the diplomatic mechanics that Dr. Novin lays out in his analysis. We are not taking any political sides.
No.
We are not endorsing any left-wing viewpoints, nor are we endorsing any right-wing viewpoints.
Right.
Our sole objective is to impartially report, unpack, and analyze the factual content and the arguments exactly as they are presented in the source material.
Because the mechanics of how middle powers navigate these conflicts, they are incredibly intricate.
Oh, for sure.
We are looking at the raw machinery of statecraft here. How domestic pressures, international alliances, and ideological frameworks force a country to either double down on its alliances or just completely reinvent them.
Okay. So to understand this whole reinvention in 2026, we really have to establish the baseline first.
We have to go back to the summer of 2006.
Right, 2006. Stephen Harper is the prime minister.
Yeah.
And Hezbollah has just crossed the border. They killed several IDF soldiers, and they've taken 2 hostages. So in response to this, Israel launches a massive military campaign into Lebanon.
A huge escalation.
Yeah, they bomb Beirut International Airport. They strike UN observation posts, and the IDF chief of staff openly threatens to, quote, turn the clock back 20 years regarding Lebanon's civilian infrastructure.
The scale of that escalation was just severe. And amid that chaotic geopolitical environment, Stephen Harper steps up and articulates a stance that would basically define his government's approach to the Middle East for nearly a decade.
Right.
Looking at that massive Israeli military response, he publicly called it measured.
Measured. And, he didn't waver. That is the critical piece of this baseline.
No, he didn't.
Harper maintained that measured stance even after the consequences became intensely personal for Canada.
Right, the casualties.
Yeah, because the Israeli military bombed a UN base, which resulted in the death of Canadian Army Major Peta Hess von Krudner.
Such a tragedy.
And then not long after that, 7 members of the Canadian Alacruz family, and this included 4 children vacationing in Lebanon, they were killed in bombings.
Just devastating.
But through all of this, the diplomatic posture remained entirely rigid.
Because it was a deeply embedded ideological worldview.
Yeah.
Harper arrived in office with this ironclad conviction. He genuinely believed that offering unconditional support for Israel was morally correct, but, and this is key, he also calculated that it was electorally advantageous.
The political math.
Right. He was looking at key demographics within Canada's largest cities and recognized a political alignment.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to truly understand Harper's policy, it might help to think of it like a bundled cable subscription.
Oh, I like that.
Right. You remember those? You couldn't just get the channels you wanted.
You had to buy the whole sports package just to get the news.
Exactly. You got the state, the citizens, and the specific politicians currently in power.
Yeah.
All is one unsplittable package. You got the entire bundle, liabilities and all.
And the friction of assuming all those liabilities was immense on the global stage.
Oh, absolutely.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this complete fusion of foreign policy and unconditional solidarity, which the analysis actually calls the Israelization of Canadian foreign policy, it had a severe international cost.
Because middle powers like Canada, they traditionally rely on multilateralism, right?
Exactly. They build coalitions, that's their strength. But this monolithic approach, it progressively isolated Canada from its traditional European allies.
Which culminated in some highly visible diplomatic defeats.
Very visible. It fundamentally altered Canada's standing at the UN. Like, in 2012, Canada was one of only 9 countries in the entire world to vote against the UN resolution recognizing Palestinian statehood.
Wow. Only 9?
Yeah. They began boycotting UN anti-racism conferences. And the ultimate price for abandoning that multilateralist identity, the one that figures like Lester Pearson had established decades earlier, the price was losing their bid for a UN Security Council seat in 2012.
Right. That was a huge blow. But the domestic posture, it only grew stronger.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it reached its peak in 2014 when Harper addressed the Israeli Knesset and declared that Canada would stand with Israel through fire and water.
Unconditional.
Unconditional solidarity. So that is our rigid, unyielding baseline. But, a policy architecture that deeply embedded into the bureaucratic machinery of a nation, it doesn't just evaporate when a new government is sworn in.
No, it's like turning an aircraft carrier.
Exactly. There has to be a transition.
Yeah.
And the bridge between Harper's 2006 doctrine and Carney's 2026 rupture was Justin Trudeau.
Right. When Trudeau assumed power in 2015, the initial changes were almost entirely about effect and tone rather than the substance of the policy itself.
It's all about the optics early on.
Completely. The institutional consensus Harper built was incredibly sticky. I mean, it's highly revealing that Trudeau's own campaign manager actually promised voters during the election that Trudeau would be, quote, more pro-Israel than Stephen Harper.
Wait, okay, I have to push back on the idea of Trudeau being a bridge, though.
Okay, go for it.
Because if you look at the actual mechanics of his early tenure, he maintained Harper's exact UN voting patterns for his first 4 years in office.
That's true.
He didn't alter the core diplomatic trajectory at all. So wasn't his early foreign policy basically just Harper's doctrine with a different coat of paint?
That is a very fair point, and it looks like a simple continuation on paper, sure. But if you analyze the bureaucratic machinery, what you are actually seeing isn't just a new coat of paint, it is an institutional paralysis.
Interesting.
Yeah, the text frames Trudeau's initial approach as adjustments at the margins, because that inherited architecture was just too complex to dismantle quickly without spending massive political capital.
Which I'm assuming he wasn't willing to spend.
Precisely. And it's because of a psychological dynamic the analysis identifies as emotional asymmetry.
Emotional asymmetry.
Yeah, observers noted a stark contrast in how Trudeau engaged with different global crises. Like, he was viscerally emotionally engaged by the war in Ukraine.
He was very vocal there.
Very vocal. He grasped the normative stakes immediately. But when confronted with questions about Gaza, colleagues described his reaction as one of impatience. He just lacked that same empathetic engagement.
And that emotional asymmetry, I mean, it translated directly into policy.
It did.
It resulted in a posture of cautious incrementalism. Like, you saw Canada loudly condemning Hamas, which obviously aligned with established norms, but they deployed incredibly cautious language regarding Israel.
Very measured words.
Yeah, Trudeau was deeply reluctant to take any definitive institutional steps. Like, there was no formal recognition of Palestine early on, no sanctions placed on Israeli officials.
None of that.
It wasn't until 2019 that Canada finally made its first meaningful break, switching its vote on Palestinian self-determination, and then, followed by these subtle shifts regarding settlements and refugee property rights up through 2024.
Right. But cautious incrementalism rarely survives a rapidly escalating global crisis.
No, it gets steamrolled.
Exactly. Trudeau's reluctance to take definitive institutional steps essentially created an ideological vacuum in Canadian foreign policy.
A void.
Yeah, the old Harper model was fracturing under all this international pressure, but Trudeau hadn't really articulated a robust replacement for it.
Which brings us to the present day. Because Mark Carney stepped into that exact vacuum in 2025.
He certainly did.
And he didn't just tweak the margins. He introduced a completely new intellectual framework at Davos, which he called values-based realism.
which is just a profound shift in how a middle power views its own survival.
Tell me more about that.
Well, Carney explicitly acknowledges that the old rules-based international order is muckling. You cannot just wish it back to health with polite rhetoric at UN meetings.
Right.
But he also rejects pure, cynical realpolitik. The core thesis of values-based realism is that middle powers like Canada have a pragmatic national self-interest in defending the normative architecture of the globe.
Because if the rules disappear, the middle powers are the first ones on the menu.
They get swallowed whole.
Yeah, if you don't aggressively defend sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the UN Charter, you are essentially giving great powers permission to act with total impunity.
And to execute that defense, Carney had to dismantle the monolithic approach. He had to separate the liabilities from the assets.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Because the mechanism Carney uses to do this is brilliant. Remember earlier, we talked about Harper treating Israel like a bundled cable subscription where you have to buy everything.
Right, the all-or-nothing package.
Carney basically takes out a scalpel and institutes what the text calls a surgical distinction.
That's the exact phrase.
He formally disaggregates the monolith into three entirely distinct actors. So first, you have the sovereign Israeli state, right? A recognized entity with a clear right to exist.
Oh.
Second, you have the security interests of Israeli citizens. But third, and this is the key, you have the specific Netanyahu government, which includes highly expansionist figures like Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir.
Right. And these are figures who the analysis notes openly advocate for territorial expansion into Lebanon.
Which is huge.
Yeah, so by separating the political coalition from the state itself, Carney's framework allows Canada to aggressively criticize or even penalize the temporary managers of the state without abandoning its fundamental support for the state's right to exist.
But this raises a huge practical dilemma, right?
Yeah.
One that gets to the absolute heart of modern statecraft.
What's that?
Well, for you listening, think about it. Is this surgical distinction actually doable in the real world?
Ah.
I mean, it sounds elegant in a Davos manifesto, sure, but can you realistically sanction the managers of a state without effectively penalizing the state itself?
It's a great question, and the evidence suggests it actually is mechanically possible. The analysis points to concrete policy shifts to prove it.
Like what?
Well, in September 2025, Canada officially recognized Palestine. And by doing so, they validated the concept of negotiated borders rather than accepting territorial changes made by military force, the quote-unquote facts on the ground.
And what about the sanctions part of it?
Right, so they executed targeted sanctions specifically against Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. The mechanism here relies on targeting the individual's foreign assets and their international travel capabilities.
So it's personal to them.
Exactly. They moved the sanctions from low-level fringe actors right up to the highest levels of the executive branch. But, and this is crucial, they did not implement broader economic embargoes against the state of Israel itself.
Okay, so the state is protected.
Yeah, the Canadian economy continues to interact with the Israeli economy, even as specific political figures are isolated.
Wow. It fundamentally changes the diplomatic vocabulary. I mean, you see Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand placing Israel and Hezbollah in parallel moral categories.
Using the exact same phrasing.
Yeah, applying the phrase strongly condemn to the actions of both. And at the same time, the Carney government explicitly positioned the elected Lebanese government and the Lebanese armed forces as the actual innocent party in the conflict.
The ones whose sovereignty must be protected.
Right.
It represents a complete paradigm shift. But, intellectual frameworks do not become national policy unless structural and domestic forces demand it.
They don't just happen in a vacuum.
No. To understand why 2026 is so fundamentally different from 2006, you have to look at the immense pressures surrounding the Carney administration.
Right. Let's look at the geopolitical pressure first.
Yeah.
The analysis highlights the Trump factor.
A huge variable.
Yeah, because when Harper was shaping his doctrine, he had the luxury of a relatively stable, conventional alignment with the United States.
Yeah.
He was operating within a familiar Western consensus.
Predictable.
But Carney is navigating a geopolitical environment dominated by the Trump administration, which approaches diplomacy through pure transactionalism.
The contrast is stark. And the April 16th, 2026 ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon serves as the perfect case study for this.
Walk us through that.
So the United States brokered a cessation of hostilities that completely bypassed established normative frameworks. I mean, it didn't even involve Hezbollah, which is the actual battlefield adversary.
Wild.
Right, and more critically, the U.S. deal preserves Israel's right to self-defense at any time.
Which, I mean, that sounds reasonable on the surface until you realize it provides absolutely zero structural guarantees.
None.
It's a deal for the sake of a headline, allowing hostilities to just resume the moment the political winds change.
And that is exactly why Carney rejected that approach. Middle powers cannot survive on transactional whims.
No.
Carney anchored Canada's position to institutional frameworks, specifically UN Security Council Resolution 1701 and the UN Charter. The analysis argues that abandoning those institutional frameworks for short-term transactional gains would permanently strip Canada of its only comparative advantage on the global stage.
Wow. So what does this all mean for the voters at home?
The domestic side.
Yeah, because foreign policy is rarely just about international theory. It is almost always driven by domestic reality. And the raw data detailed in the analysis is staggering.
It really is.
In early 2026, polling shows that only 22% of Canadians hold favorable views of Israel.
Just 22%.
That is a sharp drop from 33% just 3 years prior in 2023. Meanwhile, a massive 63% of Canadians hold unfavorable views.
The domestic political economy has completely inverted.
Flipped upside down.
Totally. In 2006, Harper's policy of unconditional solidarity was perfectly viable. You know, the conflicts were less globally visible, the media landscape was vastly different, and key domestic communities were less politically mobilized.
Right.
Trying to maintain that 2006 posture in the domestic reality of 2026 would result in catastrophic political costs for any governing party.
Which naturally invites a certain level of cynicism, doesn't it?
Sure.
Because when you look at that polling data, you have to wonder, is Carney's sophisticated values-based realism just a smokescreen?
Is it just politics?
Yeah, is he simply following the polls and masquerading his political survival as some grand philosophical breakthrough?
It's a fair question, but the analysis addresses that skepticism directly by looking at Carney's personal engagement with the issue. Dr. Novin cites insights from an April 2026 episode of the CBC Front Burner podcast.
Great show, by the way.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, with journalist Evan Dyer. And the observers on that panel draw a sharp contrast between Trudeau and Carney.
How so?
Well, where Trudeau viewed the conflict primarily as a political inconvenience to be managed, Carney exhibits a genuine impatience with Israel.
Impatience, interesting word.
Yeah, it is a visceral moral engagement with the normative stakes of the conflict. His worldview genuinely aligns with the philosophy he articulated at Davos. The polling simply provides the political runway he needs to execute it.
But even with political runway, no framework is flawless in its execution, right? The real world constantly tests these theories.
Constantly.
So what are the limits of Carney's approach?
Yeah.
Where is the friction between the rhetoric and the reality here?
The analysis is very clear that deep tensions exist. And the most glaring limit is material action.
The actual follow-through.
Exactly. Despite the strong language and those targeted sanctions, significant loopholes in arms exports remain wide open. The surgical distinction is rhetorically powerful, but the material bite often lags behind the diplomatic condemnation.
So the moral clarity outpaces the mechanical enforcement.
That's a great way to put it. And that gap has drawn significant criticism. The text notes that veteran political figures like Lloyd Axworthy and Alan Rock have pointed out this exact hypocrisy.
What do they say?
They argue that Carney's values-based realism struggles when the real-world constraints of realism prevent the full enforcement of those values. It is a constant, ongoing struggle to balance competing geopolitical pressures without entirely compromising the core philosophy.
It's a tightrope walk. So bringing this all together for you listening, we've just tracked a staggering 20-year journey through the evolution of statecraft.
A huge shift.
Yeah. We started in 2006 with Stephen Harper's rigidly ideological unconditional solidarity, that bundled cable approach that alienated allies to maintain a monolithic stance.
Right.
Then we navigated the transition through Justin Trudeau's cautious, emotionally asymmetrical incrementalism, where the bureaucratic machinery proved incredibly difficult to turn.
It really did.
And finally, we have arrived at Mark Carney's 2026 values-based realism.
A systematic, multilateral approach that fundamentally disaggregates the actors in a conflict.
Yeah.
And what is perhaps most significant for the future of global diplomacy is that this Canadian model is not existing in isolation.
It's spreading.
Exactly. The analysis points out that this framework is now serving as a template for other middle powers within the G7. Nations like the UK, France, and Australia are moving in similar directions. They are adopting this exact playbook to navigate the immense pressure exerted by great power competition.
It really changes how you consume the news.
It should completely alter your perspective. Next time you read a headline about a middle power reacting to a global conflict, look closely at their language.
The specific words they use.
Exactly. Are they offering categorical support, or are they surgically targeting specific political coalitions while protecting state sovereignty? That tells you exactly what diplomatic playbook they are using.
It absolutely does. And I want to leave you with a provocative final thought to chew on today, building off the mechanics we've just unpacked.
Okay, let's hear it.
If middle powers like Canada, the UK, and Australia are successfully establishing this values-based realism model as an alternative to U.S. transactionalism, could we be witnessing the birth of a new independent bloc of middle powers that essentially bypasses the traditional superpowers in managing global conflicts?
Oh, wow. That is the defining question hovering over the next decade of international
It
relations.
really is. The distance between calling a military action measured and calling it an illegal invasion isn't just 20 years. It is an entire universe of diplomatic strategy.
It really is.
It turns out, when it comes to international alliances, you don't have to buy the whole bundled package anymore. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the evolving world of diplomacy. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the nuance behind the rhetoric, and we will see you next time.